Hey, this is the 80s Slasher Librarian, just letting you guys know if you enjoy the content here on the channel and want to support the channel, click on the Patreon link in the description below. As I'm not allowed to monetize the channel here on YouTube, I depend on you guys to keep this channel going and growing by becoming patrons of the channel and sponsoring at the Patreon page. There's great rewards for doing so in tiers as low as $2 to $5 per month. Enjoy tonight's upload of Halloween, guys. Thanks. Halloween, the novelization of the 1978 film. Chapter 2. Judy Myers, nude except for a pair of panties with red valentines printed on them, sat before her mirror brushing her long blonde hair. She sang to herself, stressing each third note as she pulled the tortoiseshell brush downwards to her shoulders. She liked gazing at herself, noting how her breast flattened when she brought the brush to her head, then rounded and filled again when the brush reached the bottom of its stroke. She was especially happy this evening because the house was empty, a rare occasion indeed. The house being empty meant no parent to bug her, no kid brother to burst in on her or try to pinch her boobs or ass, or maybe peek at her through the keyhole. More importantly, it meant that she could make out with Danny on a couch or maybe even in bed without having to worry about interruptions. Fooling around in cars wasn't terribly satisfying anymore. Now that it was getting cold, you had to roll up the windows and keep the heater on, and it got stuffy and steamy. And now that she and Danny had gone all the way, she was eager to do it with him in a civilized fashion. Danny's suggestion of a motel in Mapleton was not what she meant by civilized fashion. The doorbell rang. "Oh God, he's already here," she muttered, snatching up her unsexy, bulky Chanel robe and stepping into fuzzy slippers. She looked at the alarm clock on the table. It was 6:45. Danny was 15 minutes early. "I'll kill him, look at me, yuck." The doorbell went off again, long and insistent. "Yeah, I'm coming." Though she knew she'd end up undressed anyway, she'd at least wanted to start clothed for Danny, and clothed in a halfway decent way, for crying out loud, and not like some frumpy washerwoman. She galloped down the stairs, getting really pissed off, and flung open the door. "God damn it, Dammy, you told me! Trick or treat!" There were 8 of them, holding shopping bags. A few also held UNICEF boxes with slots in them for coins to give to their class charity. Their uniforms were all cheap and store-bought, except for one girl, tricked out in her mother's peasant skirt and blouse and a gypsy shawl. There was a pirate, a cowboy, a ballerina, 2 Wonder Women in identical 5-and-dime outfits, the gypsy girl, a spaceman, and a clown. The costumes were chintzy and looked as if they'd tear if you'd stuck your tongue out at them. They all wore masks, but Judy identified most of them. The spaceman and cowboy were Adam and Charlie Beckett. The pirate and ballerina were Chris and Hope Ritzinger. The gypsy was Katie Schaller. One Wonder Woman looked like Christine Frank, but Judy couldn't figure out who the other was. And of course, she guessed who the clown was, as she'd put the finishing touches on his outfit herself. "Trick or treat," they repeated. "Oh yeah?" Judy teased. "And what if I don't give you any treat?" The children stood silently, puzzled. No one had ever denied them. They just assumed you'd filled their bags with goodies. If you turned them down, they wouldn't know what tricks to play. Judy stood in the doorway enjoying their discomfort for a moment. To her right, on a little table in the hall, were 6 bowls filled with candy corn, Tootsie Rolls, Baby Ruths, good and plenty, popcorn, and Hershey Kisses. There was also a dish with pennies in it for the UNICEF collection. "Huh? What are you going to do if I don't give you anything?" They shrugged, shuffled their feet, giggled nervously. Then one of them said, "We're going to kill you." Judy sucked in her breath. "Who said that?" The children looked at each other, then looked back at her. "Michael Myers, was that you? Because if it was, it's not funny, and I'm telling Mother and Father when they come home." "I'm not Michael Myers. I'm a clown." Judy caught the glint of Danny's '59 Chevy turning into the street. "Okay, kids, you win. Hold out your bags." She stepped to the bowls and grabbed handfuls of candy, showering it into each bag. Then she took up the dish of pennies and dropped 4 or 5 into each of the contribution boxes. "Thank you," they said politely. "Goodbye, happy Halloween," they shouted over their shoulders as they toddled off to their next house. Judy closed the door and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, stripping out of her robe as she did. When she reached the top of the landing, she kicked off her fuzzies and threw the robe into her closet, grabbing a blouse and skirt, rummaging through drawers for a bra and a pair of knee socks and a sweater. She donned these in record time, and when the doorbell rang, she was ready in a demure, collegiate-looking outfit. Although both she and Danny knew where they were going to end up tonight, she decided she should at least look a little hard to get. Otherwise, Danny would think she was fast, and that would get around school. She caught her breath, then descended the stairs in stately steps. She opened the door calmly as if she'd almost forgotten they had a date. "Oh, Danny, it's you." The tall, muscular boy cocked his head. "Of course it's me. Who'd you expect, Seth Dooley?" Dooley was the class goof and the last person Judy would ever date. "No, I thought it was some more kids trick-or-treating. Come in." He entered and shut the door behind him. "I thought we'd do a little trick-or-treating of our own," he said, putting his arms around her. "First you give me some of those Hershey Kisses, then I play with your Tootsie Rolls, then we have some good and plenty. Yum." He buried his lips in the nape of her neck. Judy giggled, then squirmed out of his grasp. "That's what you think. Look at you. You dress in jeans and a polo shirt, and you expect a girl to strip off her clothes?" He laughed. "What does it matter what we have on? It's what we're gonna be doing after we have 'em off that counts." He lunged for her again, but she ducked out of his grasp. "Not so fast, Buster. First of all, it's not even dark yet. Second of all, I'm worried that more kids are going to come around and interrupt us while we're, discussing homework. And third of all, I don't even know if I feel like doing anything. You take a lot for granted, you know." "Yeah, I'm a real animal," he said, pretending to smack himself on the wrist. "Besides, my mother and father will be home any second," she said, flouncing away into the kitchen. He followed close on her heels. "The hell they will be. You tell me they always go to the movies on Halloween because they hate the doorbell ringing. Hey, what are you doing with that knife?" From the drawer under the sink, Judy had removed a long carving knife and now held it menacingly above her head. "I'm going to cut off your what's-a-majiggy. That's what I'm going to do," she hissed like a witch. Hey, come on now," Danny said, backing away toward the kitchen counter. "That's not funny. That could hurt someone. Stop it." "That's the whole idea, my pretty," she said, sounding a little like the Wicked Witch of the West. She rushed at him, and he jumped out of the way as the blade plunged to the hilt into a fat pumpkin. Judy laughed. "You goof. I'm just making a jack-o'-lantern." Danny stood plastered against the far wall of the kitchen, panting. "Oh, that's funny. Terribly funny. Some sense of humor you have. Ha, ha, ha. You could have killed someone, for crying out loud." "Just help me cut the cap off this thing, will you? The sooner you do, the sooner we can do our homework." Danny caught his breath, then relieved her of the treacherous 8-inch blade, and began carefully sawing around the top of the pumpkin until the crown came off. He set this aside, then called for a large cooking spoon, and began scooping the seeds and stringy pulp out of the shell. "Looks like he has more brains than you do." "Shut up and finish the job," she said, curling her arms around him from behind. "I'm getting hungry, and it's not for pumpkin seeds." Her hand slid down his chest and belly, and Danny's knees went weak. Then he took up the knife again and sliced into the side of the pumpkin. "Baby, I'm going to set a new speed record for pumpkin cutting." Deftly he cut out 2 triangular eyes and a triangular nose, then a long, wide mouth with jagged teeth. "Got a candle?" "What for?" Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "For the pumpkin, stupid." He gazed unbelievingly at her, then said, Oh, I get it." He shook his head. "I sometimes wonder if women don't have dirtier minds than me." "Lucky for you they do," she said, producing a stubby candle from the pantry. He cut a socket in the base of the pumpkin, lit the candle, and set it inside. Then he bored a few little air holes in the cap with a smaller knife to allow the flame oxygen. They cleaned up while Judy put the cutlery away, while Danny carried the jack-o'-lantern out to the front porch of the white clapboard house. It glowed intensely in the cool autumn air, projecting its grotesque smile to the dozens of other jack-o'-lanterns that lined the placid street. Danny was not a particularly intellectual boy, but for a moment he looked out at the row of shimmering orange pumpkin faces and wondered what dark forces these totems were once intended to repel. The night was quiet and starry, with a slight breeze starting up from the north. Good football weather, Danny reflected. From somewhere down the street came the dim echo of "Trick or treat!" shouted by a roving band of children. For the first time, Danny wondered about all these traditions, jack-o'-lanterns, paper witches, and cardboard skeletons, trick-or-treating, apple-dunking, ghosts and goblins. But he didn't wonder long. He was getting cold. And horny. Judy was just finishing sponging up the orange pumpkin juice from the kitchen counter. She dried her hands on a paper towel, then turned to find Danny. "Boo!" Judy's heart almost pounded out of her chest. "God almighty, you scared the wits out of me!" she gasped, collapsing into Danny's arms. He donned a rubber fright mask, a Frankenstein face with sunken eyes and a livid scar across the cheek. He held her tightly, feeling her breast heaving with fright through her sweater. He dug his fingers under the sweater and pulled her blouse tail out of her skirt, then clamped his hands over the warm flesh of her back. She murmured and responded eagerly with her pelvis. He found the hook and eye of her bra straps, and after a brief fumble or two managed to unfasten them and run his hands forward until they cupped her breast. It always amazed him that she looked so modestly endowed underneath her clothing. Yet, when stripped, she possessed a wonderful pair. She moaned as his palms and fingers enclosed them. Her nipples went from soft to hard almost instantly, as his fingertips massaged and lightly pinched them. "Kiss them," she begged. "Are you sure?" came his hollow voice. She took her head off his chest and burst into laughter. He still had his Frankenstein mask on. "Take that thing off." "You take your thing off and I'll take my thing off." "It's a deal." He stripped off the mask and took her by the hand to the foot of the stairs. "You sure about your parents?" "They won't be back till at least 10. "And Michael?" "I told you, he's trick-or-treating. We have time, but not all night, so no more yakking, huh?" "No more yakking." She turned her back on him and sauntered up the stairs, wiggling her behind enticingly, and stripping out of her sweater and blouse before she'd reached the landing. Danny followed like a hungry puppy, tossing his own clothes off as he went along. Stripped of all but her panties, she stood before him in the dim light of the night-table lamp. Her breast rose and fell excitedly, her red nipples poking provocatively through the blonde tresses that cascaded over them. Danny stared incredulously. He'd never seen anything so beautiful. Up to now, his knowledge of his girl had been restricted to his braille reading of her body in dark, cramped automobiles. But now he feasted on her exquisite firmness, almost forgetting to take his own pants off. At last he unbuckled his belt and pulled his jeans and shorts to his ankles simultaneously. He was already erect. "Oh," Judy murmured, eyes widening. He stepped up to her and embraced her, his hands enclosing her buttocks. She lowered herself on the bed, parted her thighs wide, and admitted him. Slowly, joyously, he entered her. "Oh," she murmured again. She put her hands on his buttocks and pulled him into her with feline ferocity, exulting in the powerful muscles that filled her body and soul with ecstasy. "So this is what it's like to do it in a bed," she whispered. "Yeah, this is what it's like to do it in a bed." Chapter 3. He stood in the shadow of the tall hedgerow, looking and listening. He had seen them necking in the kitchen, then Danny had come out on the porch for a minute to set the jack-o'-lantern down. When Danny returned, they had gone upstairs. A few minutes later, the light in Judy's bedroom had gone off. Now, above the rustle of the wind and the crisp leaves of the huge oaks on the front lawn, he could hear their sighs, moans, and giggles. And they filled him with murderous hatred. The voice in his head had become subdued for the moment as he listened to Judy and Danny, not really understanding the significance of their utterances except that it had to do with love. He had heard similar sounds coming from his mother and father's room, but he had felt warmly toward them. They were making each other happy, his father and mother, and that made him happy too. Then why did he feel such poisonous rage against his sister and her boyfriend? It was the voice. The voice stirred up the hatred. It had done so in his dreams, and now it was doing so in real life. It had begun with the strange pictures in his head at night, pictures of people he had never seen. Oh, maybe in comic books or on television, but never in real life. People in strange costumes, animal skins, armor, leather, drinking and dancing wildly around a fire. One couple in particular. They looked like Judy and Danny, madly in love with each other, dancing in a circle around the huge bonfire, while he, Michael, stood in the crowd, hating them, burning up with jealousy. Then a voice had come into his head while he dreamt, a voice telling him to stop the dancing lovers. The voice had become louder, clearer, and more demanding lately, and it dictates more compelling. He had begun to believe that if he listened to the voice, did what it told him to do, maybe the voice would go away and leave him alone. It was no longer a dream voice. It spoke to him during the waking time, too. It had spoken loudly to him tonight, even as he went from house to house begging candy, even as he played games at the party. It had directed him to return home at once. Looking around to make certain he wasn't being observed, he slipped across the lawn, past the front porch, ducking stealthily to avoid the orange glare of the jack-o'-lantern. He sidled along the shingles on the side of the house and tiptoed up the stairs of the side door. He turned the knob and opened the door. He wasn't surprised. People didn't lock their doors in Haddonfield. What was there to fear? He slipped into the kitchen and crossed to the sink. "Go ahead," the voice told him. "You know what to do." He opened the drawer and reached in. His fingers enclosed the thing he was looking for, and he withdrew it from the drawer. It was the butcher knife. He touched the tip with the meat of his index finger. It pricked him. He ran his thumb along the edge of the 8-inch blade. It left a thin, neat trail of blood. He glided out of the kitchen and into the parlor, where he paused, listening. He heard them talking while they dressed and straightened up. He pressed himself against the wall as footsteps creaked down the stairs. First he saw Danny in jeans and blue-striped polo shirt. His hair was mussed and his cheeks were flushed, as if he'd been kissed with hard passion. Then Judy, a sheet wrapped around her which she held with her thumb against the base of her spine. The intruder gazed at her bare, dimpled buttocks and slender legs. Then he fingered the blade of his knife, trembling. They were kissing, and at last she let go of the sheet, so that all that held it up was the pressure of his body against hers. "Do you have to go?" He held his watch up behind her head. "I gotta. Your folks will be home any time." She ran her hands up his thigh. "How about a quick one?" "Here? Now? Are you crazy?" "You're such a chicken." "I'd be a roast chicken if your parents discovered us doing it in the hall as they walked in the door." He pushed her away and the sheet fell to the floor. His eyes bugged out as he took her body in one last time. "Geez, it's tempting. No, I gotta go." He picked the sheet up and wrapped it around her once again. "See, chivalry is not dead." "Too bad. Will you call me tomorrow?" "Yeah, sure." "Promise?" "I'd have to be crazy not to, wouldn't I?" They kissed one last time and parted like Romeo leaving Juliet. Judy shut the door behind him, leaned against it for a moment, and moaned in remembrance of recent ecstasies. Then she trotted back up the stairs. He stepped out of the shadows of the parlor and furtively made his way up the stairs, pausing at the landing to look and listen. Her clothes were still strewn in a trail from the top of the stairs to her bed. He followed them like a hunter, tracking the spoor of his prey. He stopped outside her open door, peering inside. She sat in her red valentine bikini panties, brushing her hair before the mirror on her dresser. She hummed a tune in her pretty voice. He stepped into the room and was halfway across when she saw him. Her eyes clouded and her eyebrows knit with puzzlement. She crossed her wrist in front of her breast. She recognized him through his mask and called his name, bewildered. "Michael, is this a joke?" he continued, coming at her. "Get out of here, goddammit! Get out before I—" The first slash of the knife caught her on the wrist, splashing blood across her chest and legs. She looked at the wound with more surprise than pain. She couldn't believe it was happening. Then she realized. She jumped to her feet and backed away to the wall, knocking over her chair. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" she cried as he raised his blade again. She held her hand out to protect herself. He slashed the hand viciously, and it dropped limply to her side. Now she was shrieking insanely as she realized what was really happening. He plunged the knife into her right breast, and a great gout of scarlet blood spurted out of the wound and soaked his hand and wrist. He thrust the blade into her belly. At what point she died, he didn't know. For now, she was defenseless. He stuck the knife into her again and again, jamming it into her breast, belly, groin, arms, legs, and throat. He stabbed her 50 times if he had stabbed her once, exultation sweeping over him like no joy he had ever known. The paroxysms began to die down, and he stood over her, spent. It was almost impossible to recognize this piece of hacked flesh. Blood was everywhere, and the sour odor of it rose up from his hands, intoxicating him. The gory little figure turned and stepped over the fallen furniture and scattered clothing and walked down the stairs and into the kitchen. Suddenly he realized he was hungry. He reached into a bowl on the kitchen counter and stuffed a cookie into his mouth, then opened the refrigerator door and removed a bottle of milk. He emptied half of it into his mouth with his bloody sleeve, leaving a streak of red and white across his cheek. He opened the side door and went outside, still carrying the butcher knife. He stepped out onto the lawn and stood there for a minute, indecisively. At that moment, a dark sedan pulled up to the curb. The assassin made no attempt to flee, but stood on the lawn waiting for the occupants of the car to get out. After a moment, both front doors opened, and a man and woman emerged. They took 2 or 3 paces toward the house, then saw him and stopped, staring at the figure in the blood-stained clown costume, with the blood-clotted butcher knife in his hand. The man reached out and removed the mask from the boy's face. "Michael?" Chapter 4. They didn't know what to call him, and they didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a man, so he couldn't be tried for murder. He wasn't even an adolescent, and although the law respecting juveniles was broad enough to cover a 6-year-old boy, it didn't seem appropriate that laws designed to handle vicious teenage punks, muggers, purse snatchers, and car thieves should apply to him. To look at him during the hearing before the magistrate was to see a handsome, almost pretty, rosy-cheeked little lad in a neat tweed suit, a tie, and highly polished shoes. His eyes were warm, his smile genuine, and when he spoke it was with artless sincerity. In fact, more than one newspaper report described him as charming. Yet the boy had, by his own admission, stabbed his sister 31 times at least. The coroner testified, probably more. The magistrate concluded that the boy was either mad or lying. He questioned the little fellow very closely about whether some other person had done the deed and thrust the blade into the child's hand. But the boy's insistence on his story and the absence of any other evidence, despite the fact that poor Danny Judy's lover, was treated very roughly by police detectives, and came within an ace of being accused, compelled the magistrate to declare it an act of madness. Yet, knowing what sort of place the boy would be sent to, and what sort of people he would be thrown in with, the magistrate agonized over the verdict that would deliver Michael into the hands of those howling maniacs and their gangster keepers that he had seen with his own eyes on a recent official visit to the downstate center at Smith's Grove. Looking ashen and exhausted, he reconvened the hearing a week later. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, in 42 years as a loyal servant of the law and of this court, I have never been asked to make as remotely cruel a decision as the one I am now compelled to make. Even as I speak, I am aware that I am struggling to keep my eyes from gazing upon the accused in this bizarre episode, for I know that if I do, I may falter in my duty. Nevertheless, absent any evidence to the contrary, absent any witnesses, absent any other person to come forth with a confession, absent any contradiction in the child's story, absent any regret on the part of the accused, and above all, absent any sense of right or wrong, which is the foundation of the law with respect to the criminally insane, I have no choice but to remand Michael Audrey Myers to the Smith's Grove Sanitarium in Warren County, Illinois, where he shall be placed in the care of resident psychiatrists, who shall report to this court regularly. His case shall be reviewed no less than twice a year, and upon recommendation of the psychiatrist, the boy may be released back into the custody of his parents. Although it is impossible for me to conceive a lengthy stay for Michael, whose brutal act I believe to have been the product of a passing madness that I hope has discharged itself forever from his system, I am obliged to cite the law concerning criminally insane minors, namely that at the age of 21 they must be brought before a magistrate for a criminal proceeding. If Michael is still at Smith's Grove 15 years hence, he shall be brought before the court on the day of his 21st birthday, where he shall be tried as an adult for the murder of Judith Margaret Myers. I have," he said, holding up a sheaf of papers, "prepared a list of supplementary instructions for the care of Michael at Smith's Grove, in the hope that the problems that exist in such institutions shall not damage his chances of returning to society as a normal, healthy, fully functional human being. This court is dismissed." He rose, and the courtroom, which was composed almost exclusively of newspaper reporters, rose with him. He pivoted, and, still averting his eyes from the boy he had just sentenced to the living death of an insane asylum, passed through the rear door of the courtroom. Michael's parents sobbed as the boy was led out of the room by a stern-looking matron, and even the normally tough-skinned reporters who had seen everything looked wan and reflective. One observer, however, was unaffected. Sam Loomis, a round-faced man with a goatee and a head shaved bald. He had been staring penetratingly at the accused boy. In all his years as a clinical psychiatrist, he had heard and read about such cases, but had never observed one personally, and so the Myers case had interested him keenly, particularly because Loomis was the resident in charge of juveniles at Smith's Grove. Like everyone else, Loomis had been deeply touched by the angelic appearance and manner of the little boy until, as the boy was reciting the events of the evening of October 31st, 1963, his eyes had happened to lock with Loomis's. The man felt a chilly foreboding that almost curdled his blood. 6 months had passed since the hearing, and, as required by law, Loomis now appeared before Judge Christopher in the magistrate's chambers. As they sipped glasses of port, Loomis noted how much the judge seemed to have aged. Loomis tactfully said something to this effect, to which the judge replied, "It disturbed me deeply then, and it disturbs me no less deeply now. It haunts my waking hours and my sleep. I don't think I've ever done anything so difficult in my life. But what could I have done? What would you have done? How is he?" "He is fine. Of course, in my professional capacity, fine must be defined Please, no psychiatric rubbish, Loomis. Just tell me about his behavior in plain terms." "In plain terms, he has done nothing, to our direct knowledge, that would indicate anything else but normality." "Direct knowledge?" "Judge Christopher," Loomis said, rising to his feet and distractedly running his fingers over the red and beige-bound legal volumes on the judge's shelves, "there have been some peculiar and unpleasant occurrences at Smith's Grove in the last 6 months, particularly in the juvenile ward." The judge leaned forward. "Like what?" "Well, first of all, you have to understand that as Michael is by far, maybe 8 or 9 years, the youngest patient in the ward, he would ordinarily be the subject of a great deal of bullying, yes?" "I should imagine so." "Well, there hasn't been any attempt whatsoever, not so much as a pinch." The magistrate stroked his cheek. "And what do you make of that?" "The same thing you do, I'm sure. They're afraid of him. I've seen him turn the hardest delinquent in the ward to stone with a stare." The judge digested it. "And this is all you have to say? You feel this is sufficient reason for me to extend his incarceration?" "Then there was the matter of Gilden, the trustee. Gilden is known around the ward for his pranks. The children love him. He's the only breath of fresh air in the place. One day, about a month after Michael's arrival, old Gilden played one of his harmless practical jokes on the boy. One I've seen countless times." "What was that?" "Oh, he loosened the cap on the salt shaker, so that Michael salted his dinner. The contents of the shaker fell into his food. As usual, it got a big laugh. It has become practically an initiation ceremony for the youngsters at the hospital." "And?" "Michael didn't think it was funny." "What did he do?" "Nothing at the time, but that night Gilden came down with a case of cramps so severe he had to have his stomach pumped. It was analyzed as food poisoning." "But you think—" "Yes, though I don't know how the boy might have gotten to the kitchen, or what he could have used. The juvenile ward is separated from the kitchen by a series of guarded or locked passages." "I see. Anything else?" "Nothing quite as tangible. But the other boys in my charge have become, well, rather restless since Michael's arrival. Like a herd of cattle that instinctively feels the presence of wolves out there in the darkness. They always seem to be on the verge of bolting, stampeding." The judge looked at him. "Dr. Loomis, I think you know how profoundly unnerved this matter has made me, and how desperately interested I am in seeing Michael treated and released. I'm not overly impressed by the observations you've made this morning, and it's only your reputation that keeps me from making some rather critical remarks. Now I want to know if the boy sticks to his story, understands what he did, feels remorseful, feels purged of the murderous hatred he described to us at the hearing. That sort of thing." "Judge," said Loomis, collapsing into a leather chair, "the boy's story and attitude haven't changed a whit since the hearing. Though I have spent nearly 2 hours a day with him every day for 6 months, I have nothing to go on but my experience and my hunches. And I tell you, out of the depths of all I have learned and observed in 15 years of exploration of the human mind, Michael Myers may be the most dangerous person I have ever handled." Loomis's crystal blue eyes locked with Christopher's and held them there for a long moment. Then the judge pulled his gaze away and quaffed down the rest of his port nervously. "Damn it, Lewis, I cannot run my courtroom on hunches, hearsay, coincidences, or anything but hard evidence. So unless you can come up with something he says, something he does, I am going to seriously entertain the boy's release the next time you appear before me. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Loomis breathed, taking his leave with no ceremony whatever. In the following months there were more occurrences, and in Loomis's mind there was no doubt whom to ascribe them to. Every time Michael was slighted, or fancied he was, by a staff member or another inmate, Some awful vengeance was visited upon the offending person. It might be a day, a week, a month later, but Michael got even. The problem for Loomis was that no one ever observed the boy doing it directly. One day, as the boys were watching television in the lounge, a 15-year-old got up and turned the sound lower. Michael rose and turned it up again. The other boy turned it lower again. Michael accepted the situation with a resigned shrug. That evening, as the older boy showered, the water turned scalding. The lad was harmed, only enough to discomfort him for a week. But it could have been serious, and everyone knew who was behind it. Yet apparently Michael had not left his room. There were other incidents. A nurse who quarreled with Michael fell down the stairs 2 days later, fracturing her pelvis. A boy who borrowed a game from Michael and forgot to return it suffered a vicious rash that hospitalized him for a month. What doubly disturbed Loomis was that subtly, but definitely, the boy was capturing the leadership of the juvenile ward, because no one dared to challenge him. Everyone, staff and inmates alike, indulged him, and so he pretty much got his way. Loomis wondered when his own turn would come, but it never did, and he believed it was because no matter how much Loomis challenged the boy, no matter how much he thwarted him, Michael knew that Loomis was trying to help him. The boy grudgingly acknowledged Loomis's authority, and that, Loomis concluded, was probably the only thing that prevented Michael from walking scot-free out of the institution. "You could, you know," Loomis said to him one afternoon during their regular therapy session. "That's how much they fear you. If you were to ask an orderly for keys, ask a guard or trustee to turn his back at the appropriate moment, you could stroll out of here. Such is the power you exert over them. Isn't that true, Michael?" The boy's eyes clouded, and he shrugged his shoulders. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Ah, but you won't do it," Loomis said almost smugly. "You won't do it because you have it made here. Here you have your own little world. If you were to escape, why, what would await you out there but strife and hassle? So you stay here snug and secure. Isn't that true, you little devil?" Loomis caught himself. No matter what he believed, it was unprofessional to express it that way. And besides, when you got right down to it, no one had ever seen the kid do anything to anybody. Which is why, at this outburst of Loomis's frustration, Michael simply fluttered his long eyelashes, smiled, and said, "I don't understand, Dr. Loomis." Loomis dreaded his next 6-month review of Michael's case with Judge Christopher, because if Loomis couldn't produce any hard evidence of wrongdoing on Michael's part, the judge might very well order his release. So it went, through the summer and early fall. Then one day in mid-October, at the end of another fruitless therapy session, Michael dropped a bomb. "Can we have a Halloween party, Dr. Loomis?" Loomis's eyes all but bulged out of their sockets. "A Halloween party? You of all people!" "All the other kids think it would be a wonderful idea. So does Nurse Kramer and Dr. Martin. He said he'd have no objection." "Nurse Kramer and Dr. Martin are my subordinates, and they—" "Are you sure you don't want us to have one?" Michael asked. His feelings were clearly very strong. "Of course I'm—" He caught himself in mid-sentence, and suddenly he realized a Halloween party might be just the thing. A plan formed in his mind, and after a moment's reflection he said, "Well, actually, I see no harm." The mere announcement of the party proved therapeutic for most of the boys in the ward as they set to work industriously to create costumes and decorations. The costumes they chose were revealing their deepest fantasies, and this was an unexpected bonus for the psychiatric staff, who might otherwise have had to probe for months into their minds for the same material. In the last week before Halloween, Michael began to get restless and excited, edgy and insatiable. Loomis was well aware of the psychiatric phenomenon known as the anniversary syndrome, wherein mentally disturbed persons relive the events of the previous year's trauma. Michael seemed to be following this classic pattern, and on the evening of October 31st, Loomis placed the staff on what he only half-jokingly called red alert. The children, the girls' ward had been allowed to join the boys for the occasion, were to be carefully observed, and Loomis wanted 2 staff members besides himself to do nothing else but watch Michael. Loomis needed not only an incident, but witnesses. The children were led into a little gymnasium, where black and orange streamers had been festooned, and cutouts of witches and goblins, black cats and pumpkins, made by the children, had been taped to the walls. The children wore their costumes, and even the nurses and orderlies donned clever masks, hats, or costumes to join in on the fun. Michael was dressed as a clown. After cake and soda, the games began. For obvious reasons, they were kept simple and non-threatening. But after a round of musical chairs in which a 16-year-old girl named Sophie had beaten Michael out for the last chair. Had she known about the boy's reputation? She'd have given it to him. Loomis leaned forward alertly, scrutinizing Michael. The stage had been set for something. The next game was ducking for apples. A huge vat had been borrowed from the kitchen, filled with water, and a dozen apples floated in it. The idea was for the children to pick an apple out of the water using just their teeth. After 8 or 9 children had gone, it was Sophie's turn. Michael stood 3rd or 4th in line behind her. She leaned over the lip of the vat, struggling to keep her hands behind her back, to resist the temptation to grab the apple. The lights went out. It was not uncommon for the lights to fail at Smith's Grove, especially on windy nights, when trees fell on power lines in rural areas. But it was not a windy night. Loomis had been prepared for anything but this. He leapt from his chair and ran in the pitch darkness for the spot where he thought the vat was. He bowled over several shrieking children, and groped the last few steps until he collided with the platform on which the vat stood. At that moment the hospital's own emergency generators, which tripped on automatically when the main utility system failed, brought light back into the auditorium. Sophie lay face down beside the vat, drenched from the waist up. Loomis searched the room for Michael. He stood under a basketball backboard at least 10 steps away, smiling. Loomis looked at the boy's costume and hands. They were completely dry. With a nurse, Loomis applied artificial respiration, and after a moment the girl brought up a large quantity of water, sputtering and gasping. The party was over. Loomis's trap had failed. But ultimately Loomis won. For on the day he was scheduled to drive up to the county seat to plead his case with Judge Christopher, he received a phone call from the bailiff of the juvenile court. The night before, Judge Christopher had had a massive coronary and died on the way to the hospital. Judge Christopher's successor was far less sympathetic to Michael Myers. He had only read about the case and was convinced Michael was the brutal killer that the psychiatrist claimed. Loomis presented the new judge with a 45-page paper describing Michael's personality and the incidents of the last year. And though there was still not a shred of evidence to support Loomis's contention that Michael was a homicidal psychopath, the new judge accepted Loomis's opinion that it was best to keep the boy behind institutional walls. And so it was that 15 years passed. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 2, 3, and 4 of Halloween, the novelization of the 1978 movie, written by Curtis Richards. I gotta say, yes, it's weird, and yes, I know the whole voices in the head. He's like a reincarnation of some Celtic being, whatever. I'm still digging it. I'm really enjoying more backstory to Michael. Getting to experience stuff he did as a kid in the institution. Getting even with people. That's kind of neat. So I'm enjoying the story so far. I can't wait to see this author's take on the rest of the movie. How he's going to handle maybe some inner thoughts of Michael during the scenes of him going after Laurie and things like that. But guys, I want to hear what y'all thought of the book tonight, what you thought of chapters 2, 3, and 4. And I'll be back very soon with more of this book. Thank you to all the people that recommended this one to me and tell me that it's really worth the read. It's strange, but really good. I gotta agree with you so far. Very strange, yet very good. And it was a little bit awkward with the sex stuff in chapter 2 there. But that, of course, led into Michael's first kill. And very graphic description of that. Alright guys, before I go, I wanted to say that tonight's upload was brought to you by our patrons over on the Patreon page, Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Cecilia Spears, and Sean Campbell. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel through Patreon. And guys, if you're enjoying this book and the content on the channel and want to keep hearing more and help the channel keep going and growing for years to come and fill this whole channel up with hundreds of horror novels in audiobook form, then please check out the Patreon link in the description below. Come support the channel. You can do it for as low as $2 or $5 a month, and each tier that you can select from comes with some pretty cool rewards for doing so. Until next time, guys, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.